Welcome once again to Let's Start Cooking. I'm Wayne, and if this is your first time, thank you for stopping by. And if it's not and you've been here before, thank you once again for stopping by. Now, today we're going to make a dish that actually started out as a breakfast food and ended up turning into a dessert. And what we're talking about is shoofly pie. Now, for those of you that don't know, shoofly pie got its start in about exactly 1876, where it was made for the anniversary of the 100th year of America. And before, it was called Centennial Cake. And then the Pennsylvania Dutch are real famous for shoofly pie. And basically, it's a molasses pie. So the first thing we're going to start with is we're going to start with making the crust. Now, I know there's hundreds of recipes out there for pie crust. This is my personal that I use. I have 3 or 4 different types, but this is the one I use for this. All we're going to start with is about 2.5 cups of flour, and I've taken unsalted butter, and then this one, like I said, I use butter and I don't use lard for this one. And I just take unsalted butter, and I chunked it up, and this was in the freezer. I want this as cold as I can get it. And we have a little bit of salt. We're just going to put that right in. And we have a little bit of sugar, very little. And now we're just going to take our butter, and we're just going to put it right into our flour. And we want this nice and cold because we want this to stay together, because as we make this into our pie dough and we get ready to bake this, we want this butter to melt, and that's what makes it. So we're just going to, like I said, we're just going to cut this in. We're just trying to break it up a little bit. And like I said, if you've already made pie crust, and you don't really need to watch me do this over and over again. I have a lot of videos on this. But if you haven't, it's really not that hard to make it. Once we get it to this point, we're just going to start adding. You see our butter is nice and hard yet. And we're just going to start adding water a little bit at a time. Now, if you're used to making pie crust, like I said, you know about how much water you need. If you're not used to it, I would suggest taking a tablespoon and just adding a little bit at a time, because if you get this too wet, then you're going to have to start adding more flour to it, and we don't want to do that. But we're just going to mix this up just a little bit. And like I said, it's going to, all of a sudden, you're going to see it's going to start to stick together. It's going to look really dry, but then it'll start to come together for you. That's why you got to be careful how much water you put in this. I've noticed that when I've done mine, it's anywhere between, depending on what I'm making, sometimes it's 1/8 of a cup, sometimes it's as much as 1/4 a cup. Also depends on the humidity. We'll add a little bit more. And you just have to do, this is why you do it a little bit at a time, because if you put too much in it and it gets too wet, you're going to wish that you didn't put that much in, because it's going to be a real pain in the butt to get it to come back together for you. But you'll see it's starting to want to stick together. See how I went from tiny pebbles to where it's starting to get pretty big? And you're going to notice that you can take your hand, and when this starts to form a ball, that's when you know you're done. So we're going to mix this up just a little bit more. Okay. And once we get it to a certain point, you're going to want to get your hands in there, because you're going to you'll feel it's starting to get sticky, and it's going to want to hold together for you. And once you see it starting to hold together, that's when we're going to form this into a ball. And like I said, just make sure you mix it up fairly well, because it's still going to feel dry to you, but like I said, it's going to start to form a ball for you. And this way you can also tell. See how it's starting to form now? And you can tell, because what we're going to do is we're going to put this in the refrigerator, and we're going to let this rest for a little bit, but we're going to get the rest of this together. I'll form this in a ball. Like I said, if you need a little bit more water, you can add a little bit more. Just don't go really nuts with it. You don't want to put too much water in this. And as you can see, it starts to form a ball. Now, you're going to get some cracks in it. That's fine, because we're going to roll this out and it's going to go fine. But if you look real close, you can still see chunks of butter, and that's what we want. Now that we have it to this point, we're going to wrap this in cellophane, plastic wrap, and we're going to put it in the refrigerator for about a half hour. We want this to relax now. So we'll put it in the refrigerator, we'll get it wrapped, and then we'll go on to our actual filling for our pie. Now we've taken our pie dough, we let it rest for a little bit, and all I did was I rolled it out. And like I said, if you need to see me do an actual pie crust, I have a couple videos where I've already done this, and I'm sure if you've already made one, you don't need to watch me make another one. But all I did, and as you can see, by keeping the butter nice and cold and everything else cold, you can still see chunks of butter in this pie crust. And that's what we want, because as it bakes and they melt, that's what's going to give us our flakes, a nice flaky bottom. So now what we want to do, you can either do what they call fluting, where you take your finger and two others and you kind of pinch your crust all the way around, which I'm not going to do, or you just take a fork and we're just going to go around the pie crust. That's all. Either way, it doesn't matter what you want to do. We're just going to get this ready. And while we're doing this, we're going to preheat our oven to 400 degrees. Because we want to make sure the oven's nice and ready to go when we're ready to go. Now, when it comes to where this was started, we know that it was 1876, and we know it was in Philadelphia. We know that the Pennsylvania Dutch made it famous. Now, when it comes to the name shoofly, that's a whole other story, because there's so many different ways people tell it. People say, oh, it's because the original molasses they used was called shoofly molasses. Another one says, well, that's just because the bakers used to say shoo fly away from the pie. And another one says that there was actually a donkey in a circus that was a boxing donkey, and it was actually called Shoofly the boxing donkey. So either way, the name, we don't really know, but we do know it was made in 1876. So now that we have that, what we're going to do now is we're going to make our actual filling. And what we did is we have our molasses, and again, as always, I will have all the ingredients in the description, but we just have unsulfured molasses. And we just take that, and we have a little bit of baking soda that we're just going to add right on in. We have 1 large egg. We're just going to add that right to our molasses. And now we have 3/4 cup of water that we actually boiled. So we want this nice and hot, because obviously we have to thin this molasses out, and we want to make sure that we get everything nice and mixed up. So we're just going to take this and we're just going to whisk this up, and it will eventually break up. We'll get this all nice and mixed, but we want this nice and thin. And you know, if anybody's ever dealt with molasses, it's really thick. So we just want to make sure we get this all nice and mixed up. And as you can see, it's changing color already, because we mixed our egg in there. But we want to get this all nice and mixed up, because what we're going to do, this is actually going to be almost like a custard made out of molasses. And once we get this mixed up, we're going to go on to our next step. Just leave this sit there for a second. Now we have our flour, which is about 2.5 cups of flour. And we have about 2 cups of brown sugar. And we're just going to add this right in. And we're just going to kind of cut this in here, mix this up. And if anybody's ever made an apple crumb or a coffee cake with crumbs on it, we're basically doing the same thing here. We're mixing brown sugar and flour to make a crumb. Get this nice and cut in. And then once we get this broken up enough, we're going to take and we're going to add a 1/4 cup of just regular shortening. And you can add this a little bit at a time if you want. Just make sure we get this all broken up here. We're going to cut that in. Because now, like I said, what we're going to do now is we're going to make a crumb. Just like an apple crumb, just like any coffee cake crumb. We're just going to break this up. And you can use a fork. You can use the cutter that we had before. But we just want this to be nice and broken up now. So we'll get this in here. We'll get this all mixed up. Set that to the side. And again, take your time. This isn't a hard recipe, which a lot of the recipes that we put on, we try not to make them really hard. We want something easy. We just want to get this all broken up. And once we get it to this point, where you see we have crumbs building up, what we want to do now is we're going to take our pie shell. Now, when it comes to shoofly pie, there's 2 different types. There's what they call a wet bottom, and there's what they call a dry bottom. A wet bottom, all you do is you take your molasses mixture and you dump it right into your pie crust. And you take all your crumb and put it on the top. Now for a dry bottom, we're gonna take half of this and we're gonna actually put it in the bottom first before we put any molasses on. So what we're gonna do is you can take about half of this. I mean, it doesn't have to be perfect. It's all gonna go in eventually. But we just wanna take this and we're just gonna put it right around the bottom. And just, you know, tap it down. Now, when you're gonna bake this, I would suggest putting this on a cookie sheet because these have a tendency to bubble over and it will make a mess out of your stove. So we're just gonna take that like that. Now we're gonna take our molasses mixture. Gonna mix everything up. Get this all nice and mixed again. And we're just gonna take this now and we're just gonna dump this right in. And like I said, this is where you gotta be a little careful because I know you wanna put all this in if you can, but don't forget, we still have all that crumb that has to go on top of this. And now what we're gonna do, now that we have that in there, we're just gonna take our crumb and we're just gonna go like that, right on the top. And we're just gonna go all the way around and we're gonna cover this entire pie. Now, if any of you ever worked with molasses or you've had it, you can already imagine the smell that's coming off of this pie. This is one of the pies that they used to call like a poor man's pie or something like that, because a lot of times if they didn't have fresh fruit available at the end of the year and they wanted to make pies, they would use molasses, whatever was left over. So they would make a molasses pie. But we're just gonna take that, we're just gonna go right like that with it. And that's why also you take notice I said make sure you put a tray under this because this could make a mess inside your oven. That's all it is. That's it. I mean, that's all there is to this. So now we're gonna take this and we're gonna put it in a 400-degree oven for 15 minutes. And then while the pie is still in the oven, we're gonna turn the temperature down to 350 and we're gonna bake this for 30 minutes. We've just taken this out of the oven. We had it baking for 45 minutes total. We did 400 degrees for 15 minutes, left the pie in the oven and turned the oven down to 350 and left it bake for 30 minutes. And now what we're gonna do is we're gonna let this cool completely because being that it was molasses, if we cut into this right now, it's just gonna run all over the table. So we wanna let this go. We're gonna let this cool all the way down and then we can slice it. And while we're waiting for this to cool, I'd like to take this time to ask that you please consider subscribing to the channel. Give us a like, a thumbs up, let your friends know, and subscribe. That's all we ask that you do. It doesn't cost anything, and it helps our channel grow and gets us more recognition on YouTube. So we'll let this cool, and we'll be back as soon as it's done. Right, we are back. We've left this cool down for a good hour or two, because again, this is gonna be, when it comes out of the oven, it's gonna be really runny because it has to set up. So hopefully we've let this set up enough, but I wanna show you guys exactly what it looks like. So we're just gonna take a little slice, so we're not gonna go really crazy. And like I said, there's two different kinds you can make. You can make what they call a wet bottom, and you can make what they call a dry bottom. Now we made a dry bottom. A wet bottom is basically the same thing, but again, they don't put anything on the bottom of it. They dump the molasses right on the bottom of the crust. They don't put anything in between them. Now we can just gently get under here. Sometimes this is the hardest time about trying to get a pie out, is you don't want to screw everything up. And as you can see, this is why they call it a dry bottom. It's still nice and moist, and that's what you want. But a wet bottom, you wouldn't even have that crust. It'd be all wet inside. This pie being a dry bottom, you can actually pick it up and eat it by the slice. But we'll give it a try. It's super moist, obviously. It's not overly sweet. This is just from the molasses. And again, this pie they used to eat for breakfast. So you can imagine waking up in the morning and getting a piece of this. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you will subscribe and tell your friends and leave us a comment and let us know how we're doing. And I will see you next week.